Well, that was very generous. Okay, so this next section between here and lunch is when we're going to give you the most amount of information because I know what happens after lunch. I'm gonna have to talk about conflict just to keep your attention. So basically, the big ideas are pretty simple. We were trained for a different context. It's about training, not about trying. The context that's different is the fading of Christendom. It's not that people need the gospel more today than they need then. It's that the structures are different, the context is different, and that because we're in a different environment, a different context, we have to learn to lead all over again. And that the leading in uncharted territory requires us to learn and to face loss, those two things together. So here's what I'd like you to do as we begin this session. I taught the high school. I taught Bible at a Christian high school for 1 year. I was the Bible teacher. It's a weird story, but my daughter ended up going to this Christian school. One of the members of my church became the new principal. She asked me what I thought about it as a parent. I made a smart comment that said something like, I think we should have a better Bible program than our football program. She reminded me that in our church, we had a rule that if you weren't part of the solution, you were part of the problem. So then the next thing I know, I'm writing a Bible curriculum. They can't get anybody to teach my curriculum, so I end up teaching the Bible. So for 1 year, I'm a seminary professor going back to a small Christian school, and I'm teaching seniors in high school a Bible honors class. And what I discovered was this: they knew a lot about the Bible because they'd heard about it from their youth pastors, but they actually didn't know the Bible. And so what I said we're going to do is we're actually going to read a lot of Bible. So I made them get a Bible, like a big old thick one that I gave them with margins. And I gave them long passages to read. And I said, here's what I want you to do. When you find something that is inspiring to you, you want to text it, you want to tweet it, you want to tattoo it on your body, you want to highlight it or tell someone about it, then I want you to put an exclamation point in the margin. If you find something that's confusing to you, you want to ask about, you want to inquire about, what's an Uman and what's a Thummim? What's the difference between a Sadducee and a Pharisee? Then I want you to put a question mark in your Bible. If you find something that irks you, it really bothers you, you're not sure you can say it out loud, but internally you're thinking, what? You know, like when we go into Canaan, we got to kill everybody, including the pets? You got to kill the pets? Then instead, if it makes you kind of grumble, then put the universal sign we used to see all the time for cuss words. Don't put a cuss word in your Bible. It's still a Christian school. And if it's find something that when you experience it, you know the Holy Spirit's convicting you that this is going to require a change out of you, then in my shout out to math teachers everywhere, put the delta sign, which is the sign for change, and put it in. So inspire, inquire, irk, require. So what I want to do is at the end of this time, I'm going to actually ask you to think back about this session and the first session, and I want you to think about these prompts. And so as we're going through this material, you might want to make yourself some notes, inspire, inquire, irk, require, and then we're going to come back and we'll talk about them, and then we're going to actually have a chance before lunch just to unpack them a little bit before we go into lunch so that we've got this material in here. So here's a frame for thinking about this, okay? Okay, so just know that that's coming. So here's what I want you to do. I'm going to have you go back and talk to each other. The last time you talked to each other, you talked about the way the church has changed. Now I want you to think specifically about the church you're in or the context you're in. And I want you to think about this. I want you to think of all the things that maybe keep you up at night, all the things you worry about, all the things you've thought about or the church has wrestled with. What is one challenge, just one, that you just can't get traction on? You've been trying this one over and over and over again. You've been working on it, you've tried stuff, you're there. Maybe they hired you to be the solution. Yeah, right? What's one challenge you can't get traction on? Or another way to put it, one issue that no matter how hard you work on it, it just keeps coming back. And I'm going to give you about, again, just in twos or threes, I'll give you about 6 minutes just to share that experience with each other. And let me just warn you about this. If someone tells you their challenge and you are tempted to want to help them solve that challenge, don't. Right? Withstand the temptation. At this moment, all I want you to do is just to name it, own it, talk about it, share it. Okay? Go. Give you about 5 or 6 minutes. Go ahead and go. Okay, so let me interrupt again and bring you back. As we go through the next set of slides and as we go through this next session up to lunch, I really want you to be thinking deeply about the particular thing we just talked about. The more particular, the better. Kind of the more frustrating that experience has been, the better. And it'll help us to get a frame for the kind of challenges we have and then how to think differently about it, how to break that imaginative gridlock. So for starters, here's one way to think about this. One of the fundamental tasks of leadership is just distinguishing between what are you going to preserve and what are you going to change. What are you going to hold on to no matter what? Because if we lose this, we stop being who we are. And then what are we going to change? Because if we don't change this, we're going to stop getting to be who we are. So what do you preserve? What do you change? It means that leadership always starts in discernment. And that's why the notion of discernment and then moving from discernment to decision is really central to the act of leadership. That's why the notion of needing wise leaders and leaders of character and courageous leaders is at the fundamental start of the understanding of leadership. So you're always trying to make that decision. What do you preserve? What do you change? Let me give you one example of what one church believed was so important for them to preserve that they literally etched it in stone. Let me see if you can notice, okay? Okay, so let me talk you through this for a second. So here's a couple things you need to know about this church. This church in the 1940s and 50s, it was called by Billy Graham the leading church in America. When they built this church at the beginning of the 20th century, they built a church with enough money out of this industrial city that they were able to build a sanctuary that would rival the cathedrals of Europe. That was their intention. So they have not only a beautiful Gothic cathedral, they have Tiffany stained glass windows, and they had this amazing edifice, this beautiful, beautiful thing. They were so committed to this cathedral because they couldn't imagine any other way to do this. But they also need to know they're Presbyterians. And so if you don't know this about Presbyterians don't make any decisions without a committee. So I just want you to know that whoever made these decisions, a whole group of them all got together and made the decision. And the other thing to know about Presbyterians is that we are cheap. There is a reason for our Scottish roots. We don't want to spend one dime more than we need to. So you can imagine that when they were trying to figure out what are you going to put over the front door, and this is where this is, over the front door, that every single person's going to see every time they come to this church, including every Sunday morning, one of the things they're going to see is they're going to notice this. And they wanted to build this in such a way that this would last till Jesus came back. And so what they knew for sure wouldn't change is it would be the First Presbyterian Church. Like it's the Ohio State University or something, right? It's like, what the heck? It's the First Presbyterian Church. They didn't have to say where. They didn't have to say which city, because everybody knows where we are and, of course, who we are. So we were the First Presbyterian Church. And until Jesus comes back, there will be a morning service at 10:45 and an evening service at 7:45. We know that for sure. Now, here's a couple of interesting things about this. I know the pastor who is the pastor there today, and I know the pastor who was the pastor there in the 1970s, and he's retired now. And I had talked to him about this. And the pastor who was there in the 1970s, his giant challenge as a young pastor was he had to be the pastor who closed the evening service. Fun, huh? Okay, so because it was disrupted by this radical new innovation called 60 Minutes. When 60 Minutes became the #1 television show in the country, and it took a few years for them to become, in the 1970s, it not only became the most popular television show, it changed television viewing habits, particularly for upper and upper middle class, mostly East Coast communities. Because what happened at that moment is that began where all of the three channels, count them, all three of them, all the three networks began to pile up on Sunday night, and Sunday night became family television night. So in most families, you were either a CBS family and you watched, 60 Minutes and Gunsmoke, or you were an NBC family who watched Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom and Wonderful World of Disney. And my wife was a CBS, we were an NBC, and we were unequally yoked when we got married. So, but what it meant is that everybody stayed home and watched television if you had televisions, which meant churches like this in industrial areas that were wealthy, their Sunday evening service began to crater in attendance, and my friend had to be the guy that closed it, right? So it tells us that change has been happening already, and we've been navigating change, and that external change, cultural conditions impact the church. The second thing about this is that this church today, notice, they said morning and evening. They didn't say Sunday morning and evening. They didn't even fathom the idea that they would have to tell people which day of the week it would be, because everybody, of course, goes to church only on Sundays. Today, this church has multiple services in multiple languages on multiple days. And no one could have fathomed that. So the reason why I show you this is to recognize that in every era and every time, as the world changes, you are having to, first of all, have to discern what are you going to preserve and what are you going to change. The second thing I want you to get is that 100 years from now, they're all going to be laughing at us. That we're probably not even really clear on the things that we're going to preserve and the things we're going to change. So we're having to learn a way of having to continually learn how to lead people through change, which is not great news, because humans don't like change. So Alan Duchman wrote a book called Change or Die. Great title, right? And what he studied is the people who were told by their doctors they need to change or die. These are the people who had that experience. Some of you may have had it, or had it with a family member, right? Where you finish your exam and the doctor looks at you and sighs, checks his watch and says, "How about if you pull your clothes on and come and meet me in my office and we'll chat?" And you're smart. You realize that doctor works on an 8-minute schedule, and that just threw off his whole day. Like, it's just, he ruined his day for whatever he's got to tell you, which doesn't make you at all calm. You pull on your clothes, you go into the doctor's office, and you walk into the office, and what do you see, right? Big, heavy, expensive furniture. On the wall, there are all these diplomas with the graduate here, school here, board certified this, board certified that. And on the wall are pictures of where the doctors, with their family, of where this doctor has vacationed. And you realize this doctor's really, really successful and really, really credible. And partly you begin to calm down a little bit and think, okay, this is the person who they know what they're doing. And then you sit in a big chair and the desk comes up to here and the doctor walks in and barely looks at you and opens the files and sits down and sighs, opens up the file, turns it around and hands it to you and says, "I just need you to know this. With numbers like this, you have to change your life today, or you will die. If you have one more drink, one more cigarette, take one more opioid, you have one more tasty cake, you're going to die. You got to change your life today." What they discovered is that when people were given that message in that kind of setting, where there's complete attention, where there's complete credibility, where there's data to back it up, where there's complete authority, where nothing can distract them, so they can overcome all of their temptations for denial or anything else, when given a choice, then only 90% of them will die. We really don't like to change. So, leadership is disappointing people at the rate they can absorb. I just need you to know that the next 6 or 7 minutes are terrible, right? This is really bad news. This is really depressing. Stay with me, okay? I promise you we won't leave you there, but it's going to get bad for a moment. And here's why it's going to get bad. Because what Alan Duchman did was a really interesting thing. He studied the 10% that did change. He didn't study the 90% and all their excuses. He studied the 10% that did change. And what he studied was, it's called a positive deviant study. It studied the folks who actually made an impact and said, what can we learn from them? And what he learned is this. Here's what he learned doesn't produce change. This is the worst slide of the whole day. Because this is what I call, these are a few of my favorite things. Fear, facts, and force. Fear, facts, and force do not bring lasting change. People think, oh, if we scare them, change or die, well, then they'll change. They don't, not permanently. I'm of the age and stage and generation where when I was a child, they were trying to get children to all brush their teeth with fluoride toothpaste, right? Do you remember this? They used to have cassettes with film strips. And one guy's job was whenever you heard the bing, they moved the film strip and you got to see a picture. And it would start with, look at these children, they're happy children. Bing! Oh, but these children aren't brushing their teeth. Bing! Oh, look at their teeth. Boom! Oh, what a terrible smile. Beep! Oh, he has no teeth whatsoever. No corn for him tonight. Beep! Oh, you don't want to smile like that. Pretty soon the kids are going like, oh no! And they're showing these pictures of these with rotted teeth. And by the time they finished, they would hand the kids a toothbrush. And those kids would go home and brush the heck out of their teeth for 2 days. And then their hygiene habits would get worse. Whenever you think that it's going to, you're going to use fear to change people, you can get temporary changes, not lasting change. So I don't know where you were on 9/11. My pal Don and I were at San Clemente Presbyterian, 2 miles from Camp Pendleton Marine Base, 2.5 miles from the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station. By the time the second plane had hit the second tower, we were already on alert. It's California. It's early in the morning. Parents had just dropped their kids off at preschool, and we had to get them all picked up and sent home. Because in our town, 2 things we were aware of. One was the base would be on alert, which meant the military was going to be activated. But even worse, the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station would be on alert. We were told really quickly that of all the list of possible next targets, one of them could be the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station. So I'm sure this probably happened in your town too, but I still remember before there was Facebook or Twitter or any social media, we just put the word out and like people calling and knocking on doors. By that night, our sanctuary was packed. I remember looking at Don and saying, you're going to have to lead a worship service. He's looking at me like, we're Presbyterians. We need 2 weeks to plan a service. And I remember I said, look, we're going to sing Great is Thy Faithfulness and we're going to hug. And we're Presbyterians. We don't hug. But people came and we just gathered and we sang Great is Thy Faithfulness. We told them to circle up. They prayed for each other. They hugged on each other. And then we passed around a microphone and one after another, people, especially those out of the greatest generation, they would take the microphone and say, look, maybe this is the thing that's going to get our attention. Maybe this is the thing that's going to bring our country back to God. Maybe it was something like this, as terrible as it is going to think, look at this place. It's just packed. We're all here and we're seeking God together. Maybe this is it. And then the next 3 months, attendance went up. But 1 year later, on 9/11/2002, George Barna put out a survey that said that American church attendance was at an all-time low. Fear makes people react against fear. It doesn't bring change. Facts don't work either. In the Presbyterian church, I don't know about you Methodists, but man, we got more reports about more things we have to report on, and then reports about how you turned in your reports, because what we love is facts. You can deny the Trinity as long as you get all your data in, right? It's really, really important that we get data because we really want to make sure that we do stuff on facts. And so we publish our facts. And well, here's the fact. We have been in decline for like over 40 straight years. And every year they'll put out a thing that says, maybe this year the church will take seriously that we need a change. And then sure enough, we'll see that facts get published with a headline that says, well, we didn't lose as many people as last year, praise be to God. Facts don't change people. We use facts to reinforce what we already believe, not to let facts change our mind. I told you this is really bad. I told you this is. And the last one, force. This is for all the younger people in the room. This is the one that always makes the associate pastors and the millennials and the younger folks mad, because secretly every single younger leader who is secretly thinking, once that last baby boomer dies and we're in charge, then things are going to change, man. Like you give us the power and you let us make the change. Like all we just do, that big old generation just needs to go to glory so that we can make some things change. And the worst part about it is when you get power, the power changes you. Force doesn't change people either. You can make people do something for a time being, but not forever. I told you this is really bad. Fear, facts, and force, they're our favorite things. We use them all the time, and we can't get people to change. Okay, now it gets better. Because Alan Dushman actually figured out what does bring change. And what does bring change, he put it this way, not fear, facts, and force, but relate, repeat, reframe radically. What does he mean by that? What brings change? Relationships bring change. When people change their core relationships, when they find themselves in a different community, when the most important people around you live and function differently, you begin to change for those people. So the most important thing, this is one of the reasons why the power of the church is not just our beliefs, but our community. When people come and become with us, they begin to change. Relationships change people. If you want to be healthier, the very best thing you could do would be to join a walking group. Go find other people who get up in the morning, instead of grabbing a donut, grab their sneakers, and it will make a difference. And if you don't have to do it by yourself, if you want to study the scriptures, the best thing you can do is go be with other people who love the scriptures. In one sense, it seems so obvious, but relationships change. We change for relationships. And it's one of the reasons why in our country today, when we are getting more and more segmented into people with like-minded thinking, it's just reinforcing it. So to actually be in a place where you are with other people in relationship help you to change. So relationships, it's one of I got several of my friends who are involved in AA, and one of the kind of common knowledge about AA is that about half the people sitting in the room on any AA meeting are still drinking. They never, ever call them out or talk about that. Because the reason why is they want you to keep coming back. Because if you keep coming back, then you will take the step that makes the single biggest distinct difference, and that is getting a sponsor. When you have a significant relationship with someone who's living sober, you tend to increase your capacity to be sober. Relationships bring change. But those relationships can't just be theoretical relationships. New communities have to lead to new practices. It's more important what you do with your body than almost anything else. Where you spend your time, where you spend your day, what you hold onto with your hands, what you let go of, what you embrace, what you push away. What you do with your body begins to change you. So if you join a walking group and you get up and start a new practice, it begins to change. There's like a cascading effect. Charles Duhigg talks about the power of habit. There are certain habits that when you start doing them, they cascade into change. So relate, repeat, and the relating, the new communities and the new practices lead to a reframe, a new way of seeing the world, breaking the imaginative gridlock. So one of my friends struggled with alcoholism pretty deeply. His life went completely off the rails. I mean, completely. He ended up in prison. While in prison, he ended up in an AA program. And the first thing they told him was, here's the thing you need to do. We want you to sit down and do an exercise where you come up with 100 things that you can do when you are released that will give you joy that do not include alcohol. He took 4 hours and had 3 things. It took him 6 weeks to be able to come up with 100 things that would give him joy that didn't include alcohol. It took him 6 weeks of being in a new environment with new practices to be able to think about new possibilities. The reframing comes later, and it's necessary. And once you see it differently, once you have the capacity to break the imaginative gridlock, then you can begin to live differently. But it requires you to do a radical shift. And by radical, it means that you're not going to bring lasting change by tweaking. You're going to have to go to the root of the issue and change that. And by radical, I don't mean reckless. I don't mean let's just throw everything out and start all over. And I don't mean ruthless. Let's fire everybody. Let's just wipe the slate clean. What I mean is you go to the root issue. And wherever that thing is that is most in our way, that's what you attend to. Relate, repeat, reframe radically. So now, as we talk through this next piece, think about the one challenge in your church that you can't get traction on. Think about what you've already done. What are all the things that we did to get us to this point? What are all the things that we've tried? What are all the ways that we tried to solve that thing or work on that thing? And how different it is, and how much it was probably built on the first list and not the second. And how do we begin to reframe our thinking about that problem? One of the ways that I think is the most powerful that I talk about in the book comes from the work of Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky that talks about reframing the way you think about your problems. And what they do is they put it this way. Every problem can be kind of separated or diagnosed as either a technical problem or an adaptive challenge. Some of them are intermixed, but you can start with that grid. A technical problem or an adaptive challenge. Now let me tell you what I mean by that. A technical problem is a problem an expert can solve. It's the application of current knowledge, skills, and tools to resolve a situation. An expert can solve it. It doesn't mean that it's simple. It's not trivial. It's not an easy problem. So if someone comes to you with a question on some of the most difficult texts of the Bible, those you can solve. There is a whole history of tradition. Explaining the Trinity is a mystery, but it has been done by people. You can be an expert and solve that. When people come to you and say their marriage is a mess, and they're on the verge of breaking, it's really painful. But there are techniques and things that you can do. There are people trained in that way. My wife is a marriage and family therapist, and she has walked with people through that. And as pastors, you've walked with people through that. When someone comes to you in the most difficult, heartbreaking, horrible situations, you're trained for that. I had 3 people die on me in one day when I was 26. When I was 28, I buried a 3-year-old in a grave because his gang member father killed him. And 9 months later, I buried his mother, who died of lupus from the stress. And I had to work with my young adult group to understand how God would let that happen. That's hard, but an expert can do it, and I was trained for it. And we have been too. A heart bypass is a technical problem that maybe there might be one person in this room who is trained for that. I don't know. But the rest of us weren't and shouldn't do it, even with a good night's sleep at the Ramada Inn, right? Right? You just, like there are technical things. An adaptive challenge cannot be solved by an expert. There's not expertise in our group or in our room. It can't be solved with one's existing knowledge, skills, and tools. It requires people, and look at this list, to make a shift in values, expectations, attitudes, or habits of behavior. How easily do people shift values, expectations, attitudes, or habits of behavior? They're systemic problems. There are no clear answers. They require learning, and they result in loss. Now, again, let's be really clear. This afternoon, I'm going to drive back to Indianapolis Airport. I'm going to get on a plane. I'm going to fly to California. I don't want an adaptive pilot. I don't want there to be any learning or loss on that flight. I would like there to be nothing but technical expertise, right? I don't believe in adaptive dentistry. There are lots of things that are really important, and that what we'll talk about is how trust comes from being people who are good, technically competent people. But adaptive challenges require us to acknowledge that we don't have the expertise, that we don't know what it is, that it's going to require learning, and that it's going to result in our facing losses, drop in the canoes, and that even more, it's going to demonstrate gaps in our behavior or values or strategies that must be negotiated, particularly our competing values. My coach for 3 years in this was Jim Osterhaus, and he basically put it this way: adaptive leadership for the pastor involves creating an environment which the congregation can wrestle with the competing values and the implications associated with a problem. You know this experience, right? You know that if we're going to make a change, it's going to affect the stakeholders the most. The people who this works for them perfectly right now, they like it, but it's not working for everyone else. So how do you say to the people who are most invested, right? We've been here the longest, we've given the most, we care about the most, we are the people who built this place or love this place, been faithful to this place. that we need to change for people who we don't even know if they'll come. And the competing value of being able to be a church that impacts the world and goes into the world and reaches the lost, and a church that stewards and cares for its most faithful members, that's rough. And that's exactly the place that we put ourselves in. We face the exact same thing in the seminary. So I don't know if you know this, but theological education is in a time of deep disruption. Like 10 years ago, in all the seminaries in the country, compared to today, there are 10,000 less students in seminaries all across the country, in every seminary, than there was 10 years ago. Of those 10,000 less, 1,000 of those are Fuller's students. Fuller has been the largest seminary and the largest non-denominational seminary in the country, and we've experienced 1,000 less students, but we have the same amount of professors as we did 10 years ago. We still believe we have to have the same curriculum, the same structures, the same resources, but with 1,000 less students. It's really hard to say to people, hey, we have to change for this world, for a student that's different. For students who aren't willing to uproot themselves and come to get a degree, aren't willing to go into debt. Students who are coming part-time or are coming from mid-career or want to stay in their context. They're unwilling to move to Pasadena, take on lots of debt, and to get a degree, to go back into a denomination that may not have a job for them. And what many denominations have done, not picking on you all at all, but they've required, if you are a denominational seminary, then you're going to be the only place our students can go. So at Fuller, where we have two of the leading United Methodist scholars in the country, we have almost no United Methodist students. Because United Methodist students have to go to United Methodist schools. That's okay. You can choose to do that. But a place like Fuller can't. So we have no denominations requiring people to come to Fuller, and we don't have the kind of endowment. I mean, somebody gave Princeton a cow in 1680, and it is in compounded interest is amazing. They got $1.4 billion of endowment today, and we have less than 200 million. And so you start recognizing that we don't have a university around us like Duke. We don't have a denomination around us. We don't have an endowment to protect us, so we have to think about how we adapt. And most of our stakeholders, which means like our tenured faculty, are used to having institutions that have been built for them. And it's a radical challenge of competing values. So when you think about your challenge that you just can't get traction on, and you start thinking about it in these terms of technical or adaptive, and you start recognizing that if it's very likely the reason why you can't get traction on it is that you've been trying to solve it with an expert. Oh, we want to get young people, so we'll hire a young person. Oh, we want to get young families, so we'll hire a pastor who's got a young family. That was me. I was hired at San Clemente Presbyterian because they had just gone through a church split. And they'd lost 100 of their families. And I know this because I know the guy who called all 100 of them. He was a real estate person. They had a list of families they hadn't seen. There was about 100. He said, look, 100 calls. That's no big deal. I'll do 10 of them a day, and I won't even sweat. I'll have it done in 10 days. I do this all the time. But he came back 10 days later and said, here's what we've learned. They're all gone. And the reason why they're gone is because when we went through the church split, we had a pastor who had an affair. So they didn't leave because the pastor had an affair. They left because of the way we started fighting with each other about it. And nobody with young families wants to bring their kids into an environment where people are fighting. So we had to then ask ourselves the question, the church decided they wanted to try to get back the young families. So they hired me with my 3-year-old son and my 3-month-old daughter, who I held up and said, you're all invited to her high school graduation. And the hardest thing for me to grapple with is that their competing value was get back our families. And my conviction was if a young family has found a new church home that is a good place for them to raise their kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, we shouldn't take them back. We shouldn't disrupt them. And instead, maybe we should look at the 20,000 other families and try to reach them. So when an elder shows up at my door and says, the reason why I voted for you and I'm so happy you're being here is because my son and my daughter-in-law have left, and they have kids the same age as your kids, and I think if they met you, they'd come back, and I have to look at him and say, you know what, if they have found a new church home, I'm not interested in them coming back. I got to figure out how to disappoint him at a rate he can absorb. Because we're dealing with competing values. Once you know you're dealing with adaptive change,